Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting history. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Wayback Wednesday. Hi guys. I need your help. The bearded historian's birthday is coming up later this month. Angel and I wanted to do a short, but we're having a little bit of trouble coming up with ideas. Ideally, we'd like to do maybe a parody or some kind of skit. Has to do with the bearded historian or turning 50, since he will be 50 this year. If you have ideas, leave them in the comments. I'm doing this here because he won't check here, and I figure it's easier than putting it in community post, although I might do a community post, we'll see. Appreciate your help. And in the meantime, here's our shout out. I've showed enough snail race because today's topic is tanks, and they're notoriously slow, so here we go. Shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. The shout out is for a friend. Let's see who it is today. Okay, let's try this again. Let's start. Come on. I am a genius when it comes to this button. Oh, there it goes. Okay, our snails are off. This is going to be a speedy race. There's Reef. There's Buddha. There's John Sheldon. I see trending. God, I can't see most of these names. I do apologize, guys. She stole. Old Fart. Hippie. New Bus. Kaz is currently in the lead with Patty, a space. There's Anubis again, there's Buddha, there's Spectral, and John again, and Fine, Gamer, and Carter, and Emily. Oh, it looks like Selena's got it. Okay, so hold on. Okay. This is, hi everyone, I'm Sylvia, a working mom and business mom with two cuties, based in Australia with her family. Also make lifestyle and celebrity gifts, fashion, and open for modeling. And she kind of has like a vlog, a lifestyle vlog. So if you are interested, check her out, like, share, comment, and have a good day. Alright, Mr. Bud, what are we going to talk about?
Well, today we're going to have a little bit of a history lesson.
No.
Yeah, I'm going to bore you all out. Make sure you get your pillows ready, and you got your little koalas to cuddle with, and be all ready for this. We're going to talk about tanks, because historically, an event happens tomorrow in history, dating back to 1916. The production of the first tank rolled off the assembly line. Now, our history of the tanks begins in World War I. However, for all its, issues that they ran into with the beginnings, they had to start somewhere. Now, the first tanks that were designed, if you go into your history books, Leonardo da Vinci sketched the first armored fighting vehicle. He's often credited with the invention. In the 15th century, a Hussite called Jan Zinka won several battles using armored wagons containing a cannon which could be fired through holes in the sides. But this invention was not used after his lifetime during the 20th century. By 1903, the French artillery captain named Leon Levasseur proposed the Levasseur project, a cannon at a propulsor, or a self-propelled cannon, moved by a caterpillar system and fully armored for protection. Powered by an 80-horsepower petrol engine, the Levasseur machine would have a crew of 3, storage for ammunition, and a cross-country ability. But the visibility of the project was disputed by Artillery Technical Committee until it was formally abandoned in 1908. You're going to ask a bunch of artillery professionals about the usage of a tank. Good idea. Well, until it was abandoned, when it was known that a Caterpillar tractor had been developed, the Hornsby of engineer David Roberts. Now, H.G. Wells, in his short story The Land Ironclads, published in the Strand magazine in December of 1903, had described the use of large, armored cross-country vehicles equipped with pedal wheels, an invention that he acknowledged as the source of his inspiration to break through a system of fortified trenches, disrupting the defense and clearing the way for the infantry to advance. Quoting, "They were essentially long, narrow, and very strong steel frameworks carrying the engines and borne upon 8 pairs of big pedal wheels, each about 10 feet in diameter, each a driving wheel and set upon a long axis to swivel around the common axis. This arrangement gave them the maximum of adaptability to the contours of the ground. They crawled level along the ground, and with 1 foot high on the hillock, another deep in a depression, that they could hold themselves erect and steady sideways upon even a steep hillside."
Interesting.
Almost sounds like a mech.
Yes.
In the years before the Great War, 2 practical tank-like designs were proposed but not developed. In 1911, the Austrian engineering officer Gunther Bursten submitted a proposal for a fighting vehicle that had a gun on a rotating turret known as a Motorgestalt. In 1912, the Australian civil engineer Lancelot de Mole's proposal included a scale model of a fully functional tracked vehicle. Both of these were rejected by the respective governmental administrations, because after all, the government knows best.
Totally.
Now, American track tractors, here we go with steam power, in Europe, Benjamin Holt of the Holt Manufacturing Company of Stockton, California, was the first to file a U.S. patent for a workable crawler-type tractor in 1907. The center of such innovation was in England, and in 1903 he traveled to England to learn more about the ongoing development, although all of those he saw failed their field tests.
Oops.
Holt paid Alvin Orlando Lombard $60,000, equivalent to almost $2 million in today's money, for the right to produce vehicles under Lombard's patent for the Lombard steam log hauler. Holt returned to Stockton, and utilizing his knowledge of the company's metallurgical capabilities, he became the first to design and manufacture practical, continuous tracks for use in tractors. In England, David Roberts of Hornsby & Sons, Grantham, obtained a patent for the design in 1904. In the United States, Holt replaced the wheels on a 40-horsepower Holt steamer, number 77, with a set of wooden tracks bolted to chains. On November the 24th of 1904, he successfully tested and updated the machine plowing of the soggy Delta line of Roberts Island. When World War I broke out, with the problem of trench warfare and the difficulty of transporting supplies to the front, the pulling power of crawling-type tractors drew the attention of the military. Holt tractors were used to replace horses to haul artillery and other supplies. The Royal Army Service Corps also used them to haul long trains of freight wagons across the unimproved dirt tracks behind the front. Holt tractors were ultimately the inspiration for the development of British and French tanks. Now, by 1916, about 1,000 of Holt's Caterpillar tractors were being pressed by the British into World War I. Speaking to the press and claiming the British tanks in use in 1916 were Holt-built, Holt Vice President Murray M. Baker said that these tractors weighed about 18,000 pounds.
No, it's light.
Yeah, and had 120 horsepower engines. By the end of the war, 10,000 Holt vehicles were being used in the Allied war effort. Now, the French, in their work, Colonel Jean-Baptiste Eugene Estienne articulated the vision of the cross-country armored vehicle on the 24th of August, 1914. He said, "Victory in this war will belong to the belligerent who is first to put a cannon on a vehicle capable of moving on all kinds of terrain. Now, soon, some privately owned Holt tractors were used by the French army soon after the start of World War I to pull heavy artillery pieces in difficult terrain, but the French did not purchase Holts in large numbers. It was the sight of them in use by the British that later inspired Estienne to have plans drawn up for an armored body on Caterpillar tracks. In the meantime, several attempts were made to design vehicles that could overcome German barbed wire and trenches. If you remember right, in World War I, trench warfare was the way to go. In 1914 to 1915, an early experiment was made with the Birault machine, which the objective was flattening barbed wire defenses and riding over gaps on a battlefield. The machine was made of huge parallel tracks, formed by 4x3 meter metallic frames, rotating around a triangular motorized center. This rotating device proved too fragile and slow, as well as incapable of changing direction easily, and was abandoned. In France, on the 1st of December 1914, Paul Frot, an engineer constructing canals for the Compagnie Nationale du Nord, proposed to the French ministry a design for a land ship with armor and armament based on the motorization of a compactor with heavy wheels or rollers. The Frot-Lafayette was tested on the 18th of March 1915 and effectively destroyed by barbed wire.
Oops.
But was deemed lacking in mobility. Duh.
I guess it got stuck?
The project was abandoned in favor of General Estienne's development using a tractor base codenamed Tracteur Estienne. In 1915, attempts were made to develop vehicles with more powerful armor and armament, mounted on cross-country chassis of agricultural tractors with large wheels having coarse threads such as the Abreu Gabet Fortress. The vehicle was powered by electricity, complete with a supply cable, and armed with a Navy cannon of 33 millimeters, but it proved also impractical. January of 1915 rolled around. The French arms manufacturer Schneider and Company sent out its chief engineer, Eugene Brillet, to investigate tracked tractors from the American Holt Manufacturing Company, at that time participating in a test program in England for a project of mechanical wire-cutting machines. On his return, Real, who had earlier been involved in the designing of armored cars for Spain, convinced the company management to initiate studies on the development of a tractor-blind d'armes, armored and armed tractor based on the Baby Holt chassis, 2 of which were ordered. Now, experiments on the Holt Caterpillar truck started in May of 1915 at the Schneider plant with a 75 horsepower wheel-directed model and a 45 horsepower integral Caterpillar Baby Holt, showing the superiority of the latter. On the 16th of June, new experiments followed, which were witnessed by the President of the Republic, and on the 10th of September by Commander Furris. The first complete chassis with armor was demonstrated at Souain on the 9th of December 1915 to the French Army, with participation of Colonel Estienne. On the 12th of December, unaware of the Schneider experiments, Estienne presented to the High Command a plan to form an armored force equipped with tracked vehicles. He was put in touch with Schneider, and in a letter dated 31st of January 1916, Commander-in-Chief Joffre ordered the production of 400 tanks of the type designed by Brill and Estienne, although the actual production order of 400 Schneider CA-1s was made a bit later, on the 25th of February 1916. Soon after, on the 8th of April, another order for 400 Saint-Chamond tanks was also placed. Schneider had trouble in meeting production schedules, and the tank deliveries were spread over several months from the 8th of September 1916. The Saint-Chamond tank would start being delivered on the 27th of April 1917. Now, our British buddies, in 1914, the British War Office ordered a Holt tractor and put it through trials at Aldershot. Although it was not as powerful as the 105 horsepower Foster Daimier tractor, the 75 horsepower Holt was better suited to haul heavy loads over uneven ground. Without a load, the Holt tractor managed a walking pace of 4 miles per hour. Towing a load, it could manage 2 miles per hour, and most importantly, Holt tractors were readily available in quantity. The War Office was suitably impressed and chose it as a gun tractor. In July of 1914, Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton, a British Royal Engineer officer, learned about the Holt tractors and their transportation capabilities in rough terrain from a friend who had seen one in Antwerp, but passed the information on to the Transport Department. When the First World War broke out, Swinton was sent to France as the Army's war correspondent, and in October of 1914 identified the need for as he described, as a machine gun destroyer, a cross-country armed vehicle. He remembered the Holt tractor and decided that they could be the basis for an armored vehicle. Well, Swinton proposed in a letter to Sir Maurice Hankey, Secretary of the British Committee on Imperial Defence, that the committee build a power-driven, bulletproof tracked vehicle that could destroy enemy guns. Hankey persuaded the War Office, which was lukewarm to the idea, to make a trial on the 17th of February 1915 with a Holt tractor, but the Caterpillar bogged down in the mud, and the project was abandoned, and the War Office gave up investigations. Well, in May of 1915, the War Office made new tests on a trench crossing machine, the Triton Trench Crosser. The machine was equipped with large tractor wheels, 8 foot in diameter, and carried girders on an endless change, which were lowered above a trench so that the back wheels could roll over it. The machine would then drag the girder behind it on flat terrain so that it could reverse over them and set them back in place on the front of a vehicle. This machine proved to be too cumbersome and was abandoned as well. Almost sounds like a bridge layer, like in modern use.
It does.
When Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, learned of the armored tractor idea, he reignited investigation into the idea of using the Holt tractor. The Royal Navy and the Land Ship Committee, established on the 20th of February 1915, had last agreed to sponsor experiments and tests of armored tractors as a type of land ship. In March, Churchill ordered the building of 18 experimental land ships, 12 using diplock pedrails, an idea promoted by Murray Seater, and 6 using large wheels, the idea of Thomas Gerard Hetherington. Construction, however, failed to move forward as the wheels seemed impractical after a wooden mock-up was realized. The wheels were initially planned to be 40 foot in diameter, but turned out they were still too big and too fragile at 15 feet. The pedrails were also met with an industrial problem, as the system was deemed too large, too complicated, and underpowered. Instead of choosing to use the Holt tractor, which worked, the British government chose instead to involve a British agricultural machinery firm, Foster and Sons, whose managing director and designer was Sir William Triton. Gee, let's use a company that has a name. After all these projects had failed, by June of 1915, ideas of grandiose land ships were abandoned, and the decision was to make an attempt with the U.S. bullet-creeping grip Caterpillar tracks by connecting 2 of them together to obtain an articulated chassis deemed necessary for maneuvering. Experiments failed in tests made in January of 1915. Another experiment was conducted with an American Killen straight tracked tractor. A wire-cutting mechanism was successfully fitted, but the trench-crossing mechanism capability of the vehicle proved insufficient. A Delaney Belleville armored car body was fitted, making the Killen straight armored tractor the first armored tracked vehicle, but the project was abandoned as it turned out to be a blind alley unable to fulfill all-terrain warfare requirements. After these experiments, the committee decided to build a smaller experimental land ship equivalent to 1/2 of the articulated version, and used lengthened U.S.-made bullet-creeping grip Caterpillar tracks. This new experimental machine was called the No. 1 Lincoln Machine. Construction started on the 11th of August 1915, with the first trials starting on the 10th of September 1915. These trials failed, however, because of unsatisfactory tracks.
Whoops.
Now, development continued with the new re-engineered tracks developed by William Triton, and the machine, now renamed Little Willie, was completed in December 1915 and tested on the 3rd of December 1915. Trench crossing ability was deemed insufficient, however, and William Gordon Wilson developed a rhomboidal design, which became known as His Majesty's Landship Centipede, and later Mother. Who the heck are designing these names?
Whoever's coming up with the names needs to be fired, because those are terrible names.
I like Sherman better than anything.
I'm not good at coming up with titles and names, but holy cow, those suck.
Yeah. The first of the Big Willie types of true tanks, after were made, and an order was placed by the War Office for 100 units to be used on the Western Front in France, On the 12th of February 1916, and a second order of 50 additional units was placed on April 1916. France started studying caterpillar continuous tracks from July 1915, and actual tests started in May of 1915, 2 months after that, the Little Willie experiments. After the Suyan experiment, France tested an armored track tank prototype the same month Little Willie was completed. Ultimately, however, the British were the first to put tanks on the battlefield at the Battle of the Somme in 1916 in September. Now, the name tank was introduced in December 1915 as a security measure which had been adopted in many languages. William Triton stated that when the prototypes were under construction from August 1915, they were deliberately falsely described in order to conceal their true purpose, as the workshop of the paperwork described them as water carriers, supposedly to use of the Mesopotamian front. If conversation workers referred to them as water tanks or simply tanks, in October, the Land Ships Committee decided, for security purposes, to change its own name to something less descriptive. One of the members, Ernest Swinton, suggested tank, and the committee agreed. The name tank was used in official documents and common parlance from then on, and the Lordship Committee was renamed the Tank Supply Committee. This sometimes confused with the labeling of the first production tanks, ordered in February 1916, with a caption in Russian.
Oops.
It translated as "with care to Petrograd," probably again inspired by the workers at Foster's, some of whom believed the machines were going to be snowplows meant for Russia, and was introduced on May 15, 1916. The committee was happy to perpetuate this misconception since it might also mislead the Germans. Now, the naval background of the tank's development also explains the nautical tank terms as a hatch, hull, bow, and ports. The great secrecy surrounding tank development, coupled with the skepticism of infantry commanders, often meant that the infantry at first had little training to cooperate with tanks. Understandable. What's this big metal thing here?
What?
Now, meanwhile, the Russians, Vasily Mendeleev, an engineer in a shipyard, worked privately with the design of a super heavy tank from 1911 to 1915. It was heavily armored, a 170-ton tracked vehicle armed with one 120-millimeter naval gun. The standard features of a modern battle tank. Production of the vehicle was well thought out. The gun included automatic loading mechanisms, pneumatic suspension, allowed the adjusting of clearance. Some critical systems were duplicated. Transportation by railroad was possible by a locomotive or adapter wheels. However, the cost would have almost been as much as that of a submarine and was never built. The Vescalad was a small cross-country vehicle designed by aero engineer Alexander Porleshnikov and ran on a single-wide rubber track propelled by a 10-horsepower engine. Two small wheels on either side proved the steering, but while the vehicles could cross ground well, the steering was ineffectual. In post-revolution Russia, the Velasquez was portrayed in propaganda as the first tank. Now, the Tsar tank, also known as the Lebenko tank after its designer, was a tricycle-designed vehicle on 9 meter high front wheels. It was expected that any large wheels would be able to cross any obstacle, but because of the flawed design, most of the weight was forced through the smaller rear wheel, which became stuck when tested. The designs were prepared to fit larger engines, but the project and the vehicle was abandoned. Now, the Germans, to that effect, the A-7B was the only German tank in World War I that actually saw combat. The prototype was built early in 1917 for trials, with production of the vehicles beginning in October of the same year. They were used on about 6 occasions from March 1918. Only 20 were ever produced, and Germans also had several other projects on paper, as well as other prototype tanks in development. Now, the kickoff for all this fun stuff, the first offensive that tanks took place on the 15th of September was during the Battle of the Somme. 49 of the Mark I type were committed, of which 32 were mechanically fit and able to take part in the advance, and achieved some small local successes. In July of 1917, 216 British tanks were employed in the third battle of, I'm going to butcher the name, Yerps, but found it almost impossible to operate in the muddy conditions and achieved little.
Oops.
Not until the 20th of November, 1917 at Cambrai, did the British tank corps get the conditions it needed for success. Over 400 tanks penetrated almost 6 miles on a 7-mile wide front. However, success was not complete because the infantry failed to exploit and secure the tanks' gains, and almost all the territory gained was recaptured by the Germans. The Australian, Canadian, and British forces then scored a far more significant victory the following year on the 8th of August of 1918 with 600 tanks in the Battle of Amiens. General Erich Ludendorff referred to that date as Black Day of the German Army. Parallel to the British development, France designed its own tanks. The first two, the medium Schneider CA and heavy Saint-Chamond, were not well conceived, though produced in large numbers and showed technical innovations, the latter using an mechanical transmission and had a long 75mm gun. Both types saw action on numerous occasions, but suffered consistently high losses. In 1918, the Renault FT light tank was the first tank in history with a modern configuration, revolving turret on top and an engine compartment at the rear. It would be the most numerous tank of the war. A last development was the super heavy Char 22C, the largest tank ever to see service some years after the armistice. The German response to the Cambrai assault was to develop its own armored program. Soon to be the massive A7V appeared. The A7V was a clumsy monster, weighing 30 tons, and had a crew of 18. Wow.
Wow. That's impressive.
No kidding. By the end of the war, only 20 had been built, although the tanks were on the drawing board. Material shortages limited the German tank corps to these A7Vs and about 36 captured Mark IVs. The A7V would be involved in the first tank versus tank battle of the war. At the second battle of Villers-Bretonneux, a battle which there was no clear winner. Numerous mechanical failures and the inability of the British and French to mount any sustained drives in the early tank actions cast doubt on their usefulness, and by 1918 tanks were extremely vulnerable unless accompanied by infantry and ground-attacked aircraft, both of which worked to locate and suppress anti-tank defenses. But General John J. Pershing, Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Forces, requested in September of 1917 that 600 heavy and 1,200 light tanks be produced by the U.S. When General Pershing assumed command of the American Expeditionary Forces and went to France, he took Colonel George Patton, who became interested in tanks. They were then unwieldy, unreliable, and unproven instruments of warfare, and there was much doubt whether they had any function or value at all on the battlefield.
Right.
Against the advice of most of his friends, Patton chose to go into the newly formed U.S. Tank Corps, and he was the first officer so assigned. The first American-produced heavy tank was the 43.5-ton Mark VIII, sometimes known as the Liberty, the U.S.-British development of successful British heavy tank design intended to equip Allied forces. Armed with 2 6-pounder cannons and 5 rifle-caliber machine guns, it was operated by an 11-man crew and had a maximum speed of 6.5 miles per hour and a range of 50 miles. Because of production difficulties, only test vehicles were completed before the war ended. Now, the American-built 6.5-ton M17 light tank was a close copy of the French Renault FT. It had a maximum speed of 5.5 miles per hour and could travel 30 miles on its 30-gallon fuel capacity. Again, because of production delays, none were completed in time to see action. In the summer of 1918, a 3-ton, 2-man tank, a Ford 3-ton M1918, was originated by the Ford Motor Company, and it was designed, it was powered by 2 Ford Model T 4-cylinder engines armed with a 30mm machine gun and had a maximum speed of 8 miles per hour.
Woo!
Now,
Look at it go! Chug, 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 chug.
Chug, 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 chug. It was considered unsatisfactory as a fighting vehicle, but to have possible value in other battlefield roles. An order was placed for 15,000 of these, but only 15 were completed, and none saw service in the war. Now, American tank units first entered combat on the 12th of September, 1918, against a St. Michael salient with the First Army. They belonged to the 344th and the 345th Light Tank Battalions, elements of the 304th Tank Brigade, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Patton, under whom they trained at the Tank Center in Bourg, France. And they were equipped with the Renault FT supplied by France. Although mud, lack of fuel, and mechanical failure caused many tanks to stall in the German trenches, the attack succeeded, and much valuable experience was gained. By the armistice of the 11th of November 1918, the AEF was critically short of tanks, and no American-made ones were completed in time for use in the combat. But that basically wrapped up World War I for the forces, both of the U.S., Britain, France. Germany kind of got its feet wet a little bit. Russia, who had the unfortunate issue of dealing with their own revolution at home, even tried to get on the board. But as things went for the interwar period, a lot of experiences would later, pan out. Germany, even though, after they had been defeated, they would still go back to their drawing boards, try to figure out ways to, make use of these forces. Interestingly enough, as noted, General Erich Ludendorff of the German High Command praised the Allied tanks as being principal factors in Germany's defeat. The Germans had been too late in recognizing their value to consider them in their own plans, even if their already produced infantry, their already hard-pressed industry could have produced them in quantity. Fuel was in very short supply. Of the total of 90 tanks fielded by the Germans in 1918, 75 were captured from the Allies.
Wow, we're good.
Yeah. The U.S. tank units had fought so briefly and so fragmented during the war, the number of tanks available to them was so limited that there was practically no opportunity to develop tactics for the large-scale employment. Nonetheless, the work was sufficiently impressive to imbue at least a few military leaders with the idea that the use of tanks in mass would most likely be a principal role of armor in the future. The highlights of the U.S. Army appraisal for the development and use of tanks developed from combat experience were that the need for a tank with more power, fewer mechanical failures, heavy armor, longer operating range, and better ventilation, the need of combined training for tanks with other combat arms, especially the infantry, the need for improved means of communications and the methods of determining and maintaining directions, and the need for an improved supply system, especially for patrol and armor, or ammunition. At the war's end, the main role of the tank was considered to be that of close support for the infantry, although the tank in World War I was slow, clumsy, unwieldy, difficult to control, and mechanically unreliable. Its value as a combat weapon was clearly proven. Despite the lessons from World War I, the combat arms were most reluctant to accept this separate and independent role for armor, and continued to struggle among themselves over the proper use of tanks. At the outset, thought that the tank was an auxiliary to and part of the infantry was a predominant opinion, although the few leaders contended that the independent tank arms should be retrained. In addition to the light and heavy categories of American-produced tanks in World War I, a third classification, the medium, began receiving attention in 1919. It was hoped that this in-between type would incorporate the best features of the 6.5-ton light and the Mark 8 heavy. Huh?
That's a big hope.
Big hope. And would replace both. The meaning of the terms light, medium, and heavy tanks changed during the wars, or between the wars. During World War I and after, the light tank was considered to be up to 10 tons, and the medium, produced by the British, roughly between 10 and 25, and the heavy over 25 tons. For World War II, increased weights resulted in the light tank being over 20 tons, the medium over 30, and the heavy developed towards the end of the war over 60 tons.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. During the period between the world wars, the weights of classifications varied, generally within these extremes. But it basically shows that, we went from the Civil War, where you had a lot of fighting with soldiers standing up or taking place behind ramparts, to World War I, where it was 90% trench warfare. But they started to come up with the ideas. You had the development of tanks. They started using aircraft. start, at first aircraft were strictly reconnaissance vehicles. You could see over the battlefield. Then they started fighting among themselves, and eventually they could also start attacking stuff on the ground. But this first step with tanks, it all came out of tractors, which is kind of an interesting step forward. In World War II, tanks proved to be not only very valuable, but also very useful as, seizing positions. When Russia and Germany decided to finally have their... they waited a long time to have it. When Germany finally decided to invade Russia, tanks were at the forefront of it. When the U.S. decided to finally get into the war after Pearl Harbor was attacked, we had our own operations. The British, they relied on tanks in the Battle of North Africa. And then, of course, when we landed on the beaches of Normandy, we had to get tanks on the shore and start working with the supply lines that were established as things went along. But so we're celebrating tomorrow was the first time a tank rolled off the assembly line in 1916. So a little history tidbit for you folks. And you folks have a good day out there. Bye-bye.
Oh boy.